Those things that are rare but serious, yeah.
And, not every disease
town
person can take care
yes.
of that, no.
Well, I presume that's why they were going to.
I wouldn't think, people here in Lafayette or Alexandria, I don't know that we have capability.
Well, his nephew is a big cardiologist.
Good morning.
Good morning, guys.
Yeah, okay.
We are ready.
Okay.
Let me just tell you one thing that's housekeeping stuff. And it'll be in the bulletin and I'll remind you. So, when this originally came out, it was 5 sessions. I'm going to do it in 4 because 4 is really all we need. And also, we are today on the 11th. We'll meet next Tuesday on the 18th. And then the following Tuesday, the 25th, I'm not going to be here because I'm on spring break that week. So we'll miss the 18th. Okay? So we'll have this week and next week. Then we'll skip a week. And then 2 weeks. Okay? So I'll put it in the bulletin so that everybody knows what's going on with that.
25th and the 1st.
25th is when I will be out.
Yeah, the 25th is out.
I'm going to start by reading from Luke, not Matthew, okay? I'm going to start out reading from Luke because the Sermon on the Mount, the content of that, or some of the content of that, Jesus gives twice. Okay? So, there are only 4 Beatitudes in Luke. Okay? Just 4. There's 8 in Matthew. So, and the interesting thing about it is that when Luke gives his account of the Beatitudes, it's a little bit different. So let me find it and just read that to you, okay? This is called the Sermon on the Plain because Jesus does not climb up somewhere to be heard. So it comes from Luke, beginning in chapter 6, beginning in verse 17. He came down with them and stood on a level place with a great crowd of his disciples and a great multitude of people from all Judea, Jerusalem, and the coast of Tyre and Sidon. They had come to hear him and to be healed of their diseases, and those who were troubled with unclean spirits were cured. And all in the crowd were trying to touch him, for power came out from him and healed all of them. Then he looked up at his disciples and said, so he's talking apparently just to the disciples. And he says, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who are hungry now, for you will be filled. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh. Blessed are you when people hate you and when they exclude you, revile you and defame you on account of the Son of Man. Rejoice on that day and leap for joy, for surely your reward is great in heaven." Okay? So, that's the Sermon on the Plain. The one that we are going to study is called the Sermon on the Mount. Okay? So, I want to read that section to you. Jesus has been traveling around the area of Galilee, the Decapolis. He's been in Jerusalem, he's been through Judea, and he's been around the Jordan. Beginning in chapter 5 of Matthew, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain, And after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to speak and taught them, saying, this implies that he's talking not only to the disciples, but to everybody else who's gathered around. So he's got a bigger audience. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. That's one. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. That's it. The next, what we think of as the 9th beatitude, is not a part of it, because he changes now and says, blessed are you when people revile you. So the actual legal definition of the Beatitudes is just those 8. So as we go through them, we're going to go through 4 grouping together and 4 grouping together, because they work out that way. They work out perfectly. Dealing with circumstance with 4 and attitude with 4. Our own circumstance, our own attitude about our circumstances. So, in any case, we've heard those words all of our lives, and they're so pretty. You know, they're so nice. They are comforting, I suppose, to us. We tend to let them kind of float around in our subconscious. We know that they're out there, and we know that they sort of stand as a New Testament parallel to examples that Jesus brings from the Old Testament with the law. And so we can look at the 2 sorts of instructions that Jesus gives us dealing with the law, those things that have been pulled from Old Testament teaching on the law, and then these New Testament teachings, kind of a blueprint, if you will, for the Christian life and how the Christian ought to live his or her life. However, what I learned from researching this and studying this is that they are revolutionary in nature. And they appear to be the simplest of statements, and yet they are so difficult to live by. So what I want to do this morning is kind of introduce not only the theology behind the Beatitudes, but the philosophy behind it as well, to, we hope, at the end of the class, be able to tie the Beatitudes into today's living in the society in which we live, and how we bring those from the time of Jesus up to the present day to use as our own kind of blueprint about this. There is a wonderful Catholic theologian whose name is Richard Rohr. Richard Rohr wrote a book called Jesus' Alternative Plan for Life. And he then goes on in the book to refer to it as Jesus' version of a new world order. My first thought was, I'm going to teach this book, and we'll have a book and we'll read X number of chapters and we'll come in and talk about them. But as I got into Rohr and realized how difficult he was to understand, I had to go to 4 other sources, starting with Thomas Aquinas' commentary on the book of Matthew. And that's heavy duty. Okay, that's big time heavy duty. So I started looking at all these things, and I told Father Paul, I said, I'm not going to teach that book. I'm just going to teach this. I'm going to use some of his ideas. I'm going to use some of Aquinas' ideas. I'm going to use some of Spurgeon's ideas. He's another theologian that has an entirely different concept about the Beatitudes. So rather than have you pull from 4 or 5 different sources, we're just going to deal specifically with that. So looking at this whole concept of Jesus presenting an alternative plan for the Christian life from what we normally think of as the Christian life. An alternative plan, a new world order. I always shudder when I hear that. Somebody says something about a new world order, because I know it can't possibly be true. You know, everybody's got a new world order, whether it's political or economic or social, religious, whatever it happens to be. Everybody has a new world order. And those terms sort of scream New Age to me. You know, you've got to have certain things in place in order for this to work. So I have a little bit of a problem with calling Jesus the reign of God or the reign of the kingdom as a new world order. But in fact, that is actually what he's doing in giving us the Beatitudes. So we look first at contemporary society, and this came from a theologian that has nothing to do with the Beatitudes. But what is said is that our current society is made up of 3 different types of cultures. Each one has their bottom line, or each one has their line drawn in the sand that you don't step over. Each one ends up with some sort of violence. It may not be physical violence, in fact, usually it isn't, but a violence in thinking and a violence in attitude, in approach to things. So I listed those 3 different cultures for you. Political culture, simply based on the manipulation of power. We live in a political culture, and whoever's got the top seat calls the shots. We may agree, we may disagree, we may comply, we may protest, whatever. But political culture is very much a part of our society. And as the world grows smaller, political culture tends to step over the line of people's societies, particularly nationalistic societies. The economic culture, based on the manipulation of money, and those 2 go hand in hand. Because whatever is politically at the top is going to directly affect the economic culture in which we're in. The third one is religious culture. And this is based on the manipulation of our theory of God. What God is, who God is, and how that relates to me as an individual. So we all have our concept of religious culture. And a lot of people will tell us that religious culture, certainly in this country, is on the downslide. because people are not as concerned anymore with religious beliefs, with religious activities, all of those sorts of things. So if we take those three types of culture within our society, and then we look at something like the Beatitudes and try to make them fit into this pattern, essentially what Jesus is saying is they do not fit into the pattern, because all cultures are based on manipulation of some type. There has to be a rising and falling of political culture, of economic culture, and of religious culture. So manipulation features into that. The problem is that something like the Beatitudes tells us that this is an alternative to the culture in which we live, to the lifestyle in which we live. Jesus referred very frequently either to kingdom of God or the reign of God. And he makes it very clear, if we study intensely the teachings of Jesus, he makes it very clear that the reign of God is now. It's here. It is not something that we're waiting for, maybe till 2027 or 1,000 years or whatever we can term the reign of God, and it does not work that way. So everything that we read in the teaching of Jesus hinges on the fact that for the Christian and for the Christian life, the reign of God has to be now. That puts us in the position of having to live really in two different worlds. We have to live in these three cultures as one world, and we have to live in the reign of God as another world. And that all ties up and has to do with how we approach both of those two different worlds and how we make it so that we can live in both worlds at the same time. A new world order, if we're going to use that term, and I like alternative plan. That's okay. New world order makes me uncomfortable. But in any case, if we are going to live in a new world order, we have to tie it directly in to an encounter with God. This is where so many of our more fundamentalist friends are critical of us, because it's very easy to say, well, the member of the liturgical church, a Catholic, a Lutheran, an Episcopalian, whatever, they don't have a personal relationship with God. It's all about ritual, it's all about rules, and it's all about following that kind of pattern. Nothing could be further from the truth. And we know that. And we know that a personal encounter with God is essential to the Christian life. We just don't stand on the street corner and beat drums and play trumpets and yell so everybody else comes along and joins the crowd. So our approach, maybe, to a personal encounter with God is a little bit different from other religious denominations. Technically, it should not be. It should be the same, and then maybe how we live out that is going to be a little different. But for most of us, the ritual is important, and it has its place. You know, we don't want to go to church on Sunday and hear an Old Testament reading and a New Testament reading and a gospel and a sermon and say, okay, bye, that's it. Because our liturgy is much richer. And so it's all part of one package, looking at it. But what we get into with this, I think, is really trying to decide. First, we have to define what is sacred. What does the term sacred mean? And then we have to begin to place in categories what is sacred and what is not sacred. And for me, that's a challenge. You know, I can listen to a musical composition and say, that is sacred, regardless. I don't care whether it has sacred text or no text. It's sacred. For somebody else, they may make a trip and go see the Grand Canyon, and they say, that is sacred. Somebody may read a poem or see a painting and say, that for me represents what is sacred. But there's true sacred and there's false sacred. And I think that's where we get into trouble, especially the more that our society becomes technically involved with technology and that sort of thing. And the society that has to put God even in some sort of compartment. This is God. This is what I believe about God. This is what represents God to me. Go back to childhood, you know, the child's view of God. Old man, beard, long hair, sits on a throne and controls the marionettes down on the earth. For some, God simply created the world, created humanity, created all these things, and then sat back to see what would happen. You know, how would these creations that he made from nothing would take care of the world or not, take care of each other or not, and take care of themselves or not. So everybody has a different take on God. If I ask anybody in the room to describe what is your image when you think of God? Do you see a person? Do you see a spirit? Do you see an all-encompassing thing? Everybody's going to have a different impression of that. But we need to separate what is true sacred and what is false sacred, because so many times we are guilty of calling something sacred that really isn't. It has sacred qualities to it. It has sacred aspects to it. But it is not sacred. So if you come to a working definition of what is true sacred, it has to have transcendence and it has to have immortality. And we very rarely place immortality in as an aspect of what is sacred. I absolutely cannot stand the expression, and I hear it all the time, so and so is such a holy person. You know, this individual, he's just a really holy man. No, he's not. That's false sacred. Because while the soul may be immortal, the person and the person's actions throughout life, according to Jesus and what he tells us in the Beatitudes, is not a part of the true sacred. So it's easier to define the false sacred, to see what to look out for and not embrace. Number one, false sacred begins with a false sense of self. Where do we fit in this creation, this world? And if we are concentrating too much on the false sacred, or tending to put the false sacred in that basket with the true sacred, we can't help but have a false sense of self. Because one is going to see oneself as being, first of all, a lot more important than they really are. And secondly, being a lot worse than they really are. So, first is that false sense of self. Second, if you're dealing with the false sacred, there has to be a scapegoat somewhere in there. It may not even be consciously apparent what that scapegoat is. But the scapegoat is always wrong. Remember that. And if we're dealing with the false sacred, false gods have to be appeased. We know that from reading about pagan cultures. Sacrifices have to be made, bargains have to be made. And if we delve into the false sacred, we are great bargain makers with God. I love the story of Jephthah in the book of Judges. Yes, Jephthah was a high-ranking official in the Hebrew army, and he was going into battle with the Ammonites. And he didn't have a prayer in hell because they outnumbered him, they were stronger, everything. But he bargained with God. If you let your people be victorious, I will sacrifice the first creature I see when I return home. Okay, that's a reasonable bargain. Well, Jephthah goes out and he takes his army and they slaughter the Ammonites. So he comes home victorious, and when he gets close to his property, the first creature that he sees is his only daughter, his only child. But he's made a bargain, and he has to fulfill the terms of the bargain. And the daughter has to understand that he has to fulfill. So bargaining is all a part of this false sacred. If the scapegoat, and that's very rarely one person, it's usually a group of people or a political party or whatever, is going to be wrong. We all had that when we were facing our presidential election, Bobby prayed for me, and I prayed for Bobby. You know, Bobby won. You know? But the scapegoat, whether it's a political party, whether it's a nationality of people, whatever it happens to be, is always wrong. Therefore, those on the other side are always right. So immediately we've set up a them and us culture, a them and us society. And so it makes it very difficult to follow, I think, what is, if one goes away from the basic tenet of Christianity, which is that you must believe that Jesus is the Son of God. If you go away from that, then you have to begin to experience and begin to make some decisions on what you do with this them and us society. The example that I could think of, and I only know this from reading about it because I wasn't around during World War II. I was close, but I wasn't around. At the end of World War II, the Brits and the Americans were victorious. And there was such a camaraderie between the British people and the American people. They were brothers in arms as part of the Allied forces. They had this sense of camaraderie. The Germans, the communists, especially the Japanese, were the losers. And what did Americans do with Japanese Americans? It was horrible. Okay, so that gives us a concept. It worked maybe on a political level, but it doesn't work on a religious level or on a sacred level. We have the same thing today, okay, with our political situation. The one I'm kind of watching that I'm interested in is this Palestinian guy who supported Hamas and backed Hamas, but he was in this country on a green card as a student at Columbia. Now he's been arrested. So he has a permanent card now, and he's legally in the country. But there is this great political move afoot to deport him, and maybe go so far as to try him for treason. That's another example of the them and us society. On maybe not such a pointed level, we all have built-in prejudice against people who are not like us. Therefore, they have to be put in this scapegoat category. Whether they're not like us politically, whether they're not like us socially, whether they're not like us financially, whether they're not like us racially, all of those different things that lend itself to the false sacred. When Jesus speaks of the kingdom of God or the reign of God, he is talking about what is true sacred. And there are tenets of that are easily understood. We believe in one God. We are a monotheistic society. So if God is one, and God sent his Son to save all, then that is a transcendent premise, and it is an immortal premise. So, it's true sacred. God is sovereign over every group, over every nationality, over every race, over every creed, whatever you want to label it. God is available as a free gift to all humanity. God is not a gift just for a them and us society, because God has no them and us. Only humanity falls into that trap of the false sacred. God needs no victim, and God creates no victim. So the individual who is victimized is not victimized by God, most likely by humanity. So we can take this and try to begin to blur the edges of the them and us society, because a them and us society will not work with the Beatitudes. It just won't work. Because each of those points that are made, whether it's meekness or purity of heart or peacemaking, whatever those are, they blur the lines between them and us. So we have to get away from the false sacred, because the false sacred makes it very easy for us, first of all, to create a them and us society. It also gives us some sort of justification for prejudice, for marginalization, scapegoating, violence, if it ultimately leads to that, all of those sorts of things. And one of the theologians that I read said, only great compassion can free us from the need to divide our reality into good guys and bad guys. I think that in contemporary society, we have probably sunk down into the good guys and bad guys mentality a great deal more than we should be, because it's human nature to do that. It's also very easy to do that. You know, I teach all different kinds of students, and I can just about walk into a classroom and look at each one of them and say, there's my success story, here's my failure story, without them ever opening their mouth. And why is that? Because we make judgments based on very little. And this concept of, well, you know, he had a very bad childhood and he didn't have good parents or whatever, but look what he grew up to be, a great leader in something or other. But it's real hard for that individual to get to that point. where he is accepted and admired, because those false aspects of the sacred tend to hang on. If I had to take the entire book cover to cover and say, what's one premise in there that is true from cover to cover? Do not judge. Do not judge. Despite the fact that people have a lot of political disagreements with Pope Francis, Pope Francis is a character, an individual who says, who am I to judge? I'm just like all the rest of the flock. So this concept of do not judge, do not form a judgment that is based on false sacred, and do not categorize individuals. And the Beatitudes, in a very simplistic way, warns us against categorizing things. Empathy for the victim. That's probably the most transformational teaching of Jesus. His empathy for victims. Jesus had no problem with the woman at the well. Sat down and had a nice conversation with her. He had no problem with people who have physical affliction. No problem with people who had mental affliction. No problem with people who were possessed, even. And we probably, if truth be told, wouldn't have a great impression of someone that we believe perhaps was possessed or involved in demonic activity or whatever. We want to stay as far away from that as we can get. Jesus went head first into it. Of course, he could do that. And one expected that of him. All of these crowds of people that flocked to hear Jesus because they knew he could heal them, whether it was physical or mental or demonic. And they knew that the way that he presented this alternative plan for the Christian life worked. It worked, regardless. So, while empathy for the victim, I think, is, as I said, the most transformational aspect of Jesus' teaching, it's also the most difficult to deal with. Jesus makes this statement in there, you know, the first shall be last, and the last shall be first. And that's a concept that we really don't like. Nobody wants to be last. You know, nobody wants to be chosen last for the team or left sitting there. That sort of thing. Unless the system itself is so flawed that you don't want to be first. You know, you want to stay back and avoid as long as you can. So St. Paul talks about this, what he calls the folly of the cross. And what St. Paul meant by that is that Jesus, when he was ministering and teaching during his time on earth, turned human nature upside down. Because certainly neither the Jews nor the Gentiles were accustomed to empathizing with the victim or turning the other cheek are all of the things that we associate with Jesus' somewhat rebellious nature toward society as a whole, and the way that he viewed society as a whole. The problem with the false sacred, and I was reminded of this with listening to the gospel reading for this past weekend, and Father Paul's homily on that. The problem with the false sacred is that there's just enough sacred in it to fool us totally. The same thing happened when Jesus was tempted. Turn this into bread and eat it. You're hungry, you haven't eaten in 40 days. Seriously? That's unimaginable. But Jesus comes back quoting the law and the way in which the law would apply in his time. And so he can very easily say, the temptation is taking Jesus at the point in which the temptation would be greatest and turning it upside down. Perhaps apathy is our greatest temptation, I think. And I say that because I see most of society, certainly the people here in Woodworth, the people here in this church parish, do not suffer from a lot of things. And the things that we all suffer from are not terribly apparent to other people, especially if we don't want them to be. So we may have a great problem or a great burden or a great cross to bear, whatever. But we buck up. How are you doing? Oh, I'm fine. Maybe you are and maybe you aren't, So, so I think we have to look at what I was talking about with apathy as being perhaps the greatest temptation that we face, because it has become so easy simply to say, not my circus, not my monkeys. I say that all the time. In excusing my own apathy for something that I see that I don't believe is right. So, as I said just a minute ago, the false sacred has just enough sacred in it to confuse us. The same thing happened in Jesus' time. What group of people gave Jesus the most trouble? The well-educated and the well-off economically. The poor beggar didn't give Jesus a problem. The poor beggar was grasping at straws. I'll believe you can heal me. I'll believe anything, because it's a desperate situation. But for us, good people, well, he's a really good person. Is he sacred? No. No, not at all. Well-educated, a good person is kind to other people, treats other people well, is generous with his affluence, all of those sorts of things are part of the false sacred. Because that group of people we desperately want to justify and make it okay. And it doesn't often work. It's sometimes, I think, very hard to find the true sacred and to differentiate between the true sacred and the false sacred, simply because, as I said, there's just enough sacred in false sacred to make it confusing. So let's look at 4 different aspects of differentiating between the two. Number 1, anything that is mysterious, that is unknown, that is hidden, often gets labeled as sacred. If something is a mystery to us, it is beyond us, intellectually, primarily, sometimes emotionally. And it may be riddled with the false sacred, but it's just mysterious enough that we can't quite figure out. Is it sacred? Is it not? Anything that is well known, that is well admired, that is famous, oftentimes gets thrown into the sacred. Sports heroes, that's a prime example of it. The way we idolize football teams, baseball teams, that sort of thing. The way that many people idolize people in the entertainment business, movie stars, same thing. It's confusing because there's just enough of the sacred in it to confuse us. Anything that's larger than life, that's powerful, that inspires wonder in us. We're bad about doing that with political figures. Anything within the natural world, we often label as sacred. You know, I'm standing looking at the Grand Canyon. Yes, it was created by God, but it does not fall into that category of what is sacred. Everybody's saying, whoa, wait a minute, hold on. What are you talking about? I'm talking about a reflection of the light and the light. Jesus Christ is the light. And if we attribute the light to something else or someone else, then we have embraced the false sacred. My mother is standing behind me now telling me, because I was raised in a very Irish family and a very Celtic family. Well, the Celts believe that everything is consisting of God. Therefore, it is sacred. This table is sacred by Celtic theology. because God is in this table. This is a totally differing view, this alternative plan, this alternative lifestyle, and how it works. Now, I think that I have to leave that now, and I realize I'm leaving you hanging because until we get into studying the Beatitudes, it's not going to make a whole lot of sense to us. I think maybe in a couple of weeks, once we've gone through the Beatitudes, and we come back to tie up all the loose ends, that we can begin to say, yep, I see now, there's the light and there's the reflection of the light. There's the true sacred and there is the false sacred. And so it's difficult to separate, but we have to separate because the true sacred is the measure of all things. And we can only use the true sacred to understand God, to understand the life and ministry of Jesus Christ and the place that Jesus must find within ourselves. It would be a wonderful thing in our world if God were always placed first. That's how it was intended. There would still be pain. There would still be tragedy. There would still be bad things happening to good people. But it would all work out if God were first. And the reason is that if God is first, relationships between us, between all people, would be right. The greatest tragedy of the world is people unable to have a right relationship with each other. It causes wars. It causes all sorts of difficulties living one's life if we don't have the right relationship with those that we share the world and we share our existence with. So, connection between people, communion between people, communication between people. All this is going to merge together and make sense of the Beatitudes. Without that, there is no making sense of it. How do we make sense of blessed are the meek? Meek is a derogatory term now in our society. How do we make sense out of blessed are the peacemakers? That's another problematic one. But looking at the Beatitudes, we come to the realization, let's just take that, blessed are the peacemakers. There is no way to peace. There is no road to peace. Peace is the way itself. There is no path to love. Loving is the path. It all demands an action on our part. And each one of those Beatitudes demands an action on our part and a change in our own attitude and our own view of the world and the view of God. They go a whole lot deeper. That's why I said at the beginning, they're nice, pretty sayings, and we love to hear those, read. When it comes around time that you hear the book of Matthew in the Mass and the Beatitudes are read. Isn't this wonderful? But it demands an awful lot of us. To be meek goes against our nature, and it demands a lot of us. The pure in heart. What does it mean to mourn? All of these nice little simplistic premises go so much deeper that generally, on the whole, we don't really get it. We don't really get what Jesus is telling us. The Beatitudes doesn't give us the way to salvation. It's not a nice little thing we can wrap up and say, you must believe in Jesus Christ as the Son of God who was sent to the world to save humanity's souls. That's pretty tied up. All of these different characteristics tell us who is saved and why are they saved. Because they have managed to get all of the false sacred out of the way and are working just with that which is true. So, leading in to the Sermon on the Mount, okay, because this one he goes up the hill, we have some basic premises that we have to look at. The first one is the occasion of Jesus' teaching. Some of his teaching, when we read the teachings of Jesus, some of his teaching is just for a select group, maybe just his disciples. And he will take them off by themselves and give them instruction. At the opposite end of that, some of his teaching is for the multitudes. Kind of a representation of the world and the world's people. Jesus being, if you can think about this, if you remember your high school English, Jesus is every man. Remember that book, Every Man? Everybody had to read that. Jesus is every man. He's fully human, and he represents all of people. So the occasion for this is obviously the crowds. Jesus went to a place that would accommodate crowds. Because in this particular instance in Matthew, so many people were following him. And he wanted to give instruction to everybody who could hear it. So what did he do? He went up above the people to speak down to them. If you look at the history of the New Testament, most likely, this was a place called the Horn of Hattim. The Horn of Hattim literally was a volcano. An inactive volcano. But the point at which scholars believe Jesus preached the Sermon on the Mount is from a seated position on the rim of this volcano, which would give him Mother Nature's microphone. There wouldn't be anybody that couldn't hear him because of the echo effect. And so it's important, the occasion, the place. Jesus saw the crowds, and we all know Jesus sees everything. He saw their distress, he saw their advantages, he saw their problems, he saw everything. And so he goes to a place where he can talk to them just as he would have talked to his disciples, but where everybody could hear him. He sat down. In Hebrew tradition, the rabbi always sat to teach in the synagogue. The rabbi never stood and lectured. The students stood. There's a reversal. Mine wouldn't tolerate it. But Jesus sat down, and there is significance to that. Occasions, and if you go through the ministry of Jesus and the teachings of Jesus, it's interesting to look at his speaking to people, his talking to people, whether he is standing or sitting. And there are different occasions. And we will find times when Jesus stood up. But there are other occasions when you go back and read, for example, Jesus' encounter with the Samaritan woman. He sat down at the well when he talked to her. So there's that, the position. There's the style of his sermon. Luke tells us he opened his mouth and spoke to the disciples. Here, it simply says that he began to speak. So he wasn't ranting and raving and carrying on to these multitudes of people, but probably simply talking. And what does he say? He says, blessed. The Greek word is makarios. And this will be in next week's handout, so you don't have to, that's why I didn't put it in this. The Greek word is makarios. Makarios is not ever translated as blessed. It translates as happy. Happy. But it's an inner happiness. It's not a happiness that you could interchange the word rejoice for. Happiness is not joy. Happiness is a state of being that is not influenced by circumstance. And that's really a significant point. There are words, the common Hebrew word for blessed is Barakhu. God blesses his people. The word Barakhu is used. But never in these Beatitudes from Matthew is the word blessed ever used. The word Makarios is used, which is happiness. There's another word that could be used. There is a word, ashrei, which means you live a blessed life. You lead a good life. But you may not always be happy. So, there's a difference there. And if we look at, and most believe that Matthew originally came from, not Hebrew, even though it is the Jewish gospel of the Synoptic Gospels. But the connection between Hebrew and Aramaic was so close that in Jesus' time, Aramaic was a dialect, if you will, of Hebrew. It was down to earth. And while in Jesus' day, Hebrew and Aramaic were both spoken languages, we don't find the connection between Hebrew and Aramaic being the same today. They are totally different. But commonly it is believed that Matthew was written and then very early translated into Greek, because the Gospel of Matthew, left in its Aramaic form, would have only been of use to Jewish people, to Jewish converts to early Christianity. It would have no meaning for the Gentile. And so very early on, we know that Matthew was translated into the Greek. And we see that word Makarios being used over and over and over again. Same word. Meaning simply happiness. Not because of what life has dealt me, or not because of any sort of advantageous circumstance. And Makarios is not a passing emotion. It's not one that you can say, well, I'm happy today, but yesterday I was really unhappy. That word cannot be used in a situation like that, because there is no opposite of happy, Makarios. It means a happiness that the individual possesses regardless of circumstance. And so we have to look at those 8 Beatitudes, devoid of circumstance, and look at it as Jesus simply saying, you want to know how to live a Christian life? You want to know what happiness is? Here it is. This is what it is. Very simple, very straightforward. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Next week we will do Beatitudes 1 through 4.